Sorry I can't be there today, guys, but I'm hoping I can still share literature with you. So we'll see how this goes. This is the third time I've tried, though, so we'll see. Little man Christopher John, Claude, and I were sitting on the bottom step of the 7th grade class building after school waiting for Stacy and TJ when the front door banged open and TJ shot out and tore across the yard. "What's the matter with him?" asked Christopher John. "Ain't he going to wait for Stacy?" The rest of the 7th grade, led by little Willie Wiggins and Mo Turner, spilled from the building. "There he go!" cried little Willie as TJ disappeared on the forest road. Mo Turner yelled, "Let's see where he going." And then he and 3 other boys dashed away in pursuit of TJ. But the others stood restlessly near the steps as if school had not yet ended. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked little Willie. "What's everybody waiting around for? And where's Stacy?" demanded little man. Little Willie smiled. "Stacy inside with Miss Logan. He got whipped today." "Whipped?" I cried. "Well, can't nobody whip Stacy. Who done it?" "Your mama," laughed little Willie. "Mama?" Christopher John, little man, and I exclaimed. Little Willie nodded. "Yep, in front of everybody." I swallowed hard, feeling very sorry for my older brother. It was bad enough to be whipped in front of 30 others by a teacher, but to get it by one's own mother? Now that was downright embarrassing. "Why'd Mama do that?" asked Christopher John. "She caught him with cheat notes during the history examination." "Well, Mama knows Stacy wouldn't cheat," I declared. Little Willie shrugged. "Well, whether she knowed it or not, she sure enough whipped him. Course now she give him a chance to get out of it when he said he wasn't cheating, and she asked him how he got them cheat notes. But Stacy wouldn't tell on old TJ, and you know good and well old TJ wasn't about to say them notes is his." "Cheat notes? But how'd TJ get cheat notes? Stacy got rid of them things this morning." "Come noontime, though," replied little Willie, "TJ was in them woods busy writing himself another set. Me and Mo seen him." "Well, what the devil was Stacy doing with him?" "Well, we was in the middle of the examination, and old TJ slips out these cheat notes. Me and Clarence here was sitting right behind him and TJ, and we seen the whole thing. Stacy was sitting right side of TJ, and when he seen them notes, he motioned TJ to put 'em away. And at first TJ wouldn't do it, but then he seen Miss Logan starting toward him, and he slipped Stacy the notes. Well, Stacy didn't see Miss Logan coming, and when he took them notes, and by the time he saw her, it was too late to get rid of 'em. Wasn't nothing Miss Logan could do but whip him. Failed him, too." "And old TJ just sat there and ain't said a word," interjected Clarence, laughing. "But knowing Stacy, I bet you old TJ ain't going to get away with it," chuckled little Willie. "And TJ know it, too. That's why he lit out of here like he done. And I'll bet you... Hey, Stacy!" Everybody turned as Stacy bounded down the steps. His square face was unsmiling, but there was no anger in his voice when he asked quietly, "Anybody seen TJ?" All the students answered at once, indicating that TJ had headed west toward home, and then surrounded Stacy as he started across the lawn. Christopher John, little man, Claude, and I followed. When we reached the crossroads, Mo Turner was waiting. "TJ went down to the Wallace store," he announced. Stacy stopped, and so did everybody else. Stacy stared past Jefferson Davis, and then back down the road toward Great Faith, looking over his shoulder. He found me and ordered, "Cassie, you and Christopher John and Man, go on home." "You come too," I said, afraid of where he was going. "Got something to take care of first," he said, walking away. "Mama gonna take care of you too," I hollered after him. "You know she said we weren't supposed to go down there, and she find out she gonna wear you out again. Papa too." But Stacy did not come back. For a moment, little man, Christopher John, Claude, and I stood watching Stacy and the others heading swiftly northward, and then little man said, "I want to see what he gonna do." "I don't," declared Christopher John. "Come on," I said, starting after Stacy with little man and Claude beside me. "I don't want no whipping," objected Christopher John, standing alone in the crossroads. But when he saw that we were not coming back, he puffed to join us, grumbling all the while. The Wallace store stood almost a half a mile beyond Jefferson Davis, on a triangular lot that faced the Soldiers Bridge crossroad. Once the Granger Plantation store, it had been run by the Wallaces for as long as I could remember, and most of the people within the 40-mile stretch between Smellens Creek and Strawberry shopped there. The other three corners of the crossroad were forest land, black and dense. The store consisted of a small building with a gas pump in front and a storage house in back. Beyond the store, against the forest edge, were two great clapboard houses and a small garden, but there were no fields. The Wallaces did not farm. Clapboard, by the way, would sort of be like scrap lumber. So if this is scrap lumber that their houses are built on, do you think that they're rich or do you think that they're poor? I'll think about that. Stacy and the other students were standing in the doorway of the store when little man Christopher John Claude and I ran up. We squeezed through so we could see inside. A man we all know was Caleb Wallace stood behind the counter. A few other men sat around the stove playing checkers, and Jeremy's older brothers, R.W. and Melvin, who had dropped out of school long ago, leaned sleepy-eyed against the counter staring at us. "Y'all go on in the back," said Caleb Wallace. "Listen, y'all want to buy something. Mr. Dewberry got the music on already." As we turned away from the entrance, Melvin Sims said, "Just look at all the little niggas come to dance." And the laughter of the men filled the room. Christopher John tugged at my arm. "I don't like this place, Cassie. Let's go on home." "We can't leave without Stacy," I said. Music beckoned from the storage room where Dewberry Wallace was placing round brown bottles on a small table as we crowded in. Aside from the table, there was no furniture in the room. Boxes lined the walls, and the center floor had been cleared for dancing. Several older couples from Great Faith were already engaged in movements I had never seen before. "What are they doing?" asked little man. I shrugged. "I guess that's what they call dancing." "There he go!" someone shouted as the back door of the storeroom slammed shut. Stacy turned quickly and sped to the back of the building. TJ was fleeing straight toward Soldiers Road. Stacy tore across the Wallace yard and, leaping high like a forest fox, fell upon TJ, knocking him down. The two boys rolled toward the road, each trying to keep the other's back pinned to the ground, but then Stacy, who was stronger, gained the advantage, and TJ, finding that he could not budge him, cried, Hey, wait a minute, man, let me explain." Stacy did not let him finish. Jumping up, he pulled TJ up too and hit him squarely in the face. TJ staggered back, holding his eyes, as if he were badly hurt, and Stacy momentarily let down his guard. At that moment, TJ rammed into Stacy, forcing the fight to the ground again. Little man Christopher John and I, with the others, circled the fighters, chanting loudly as they rolled back and forth, punching at each other. All of us were so engrossed in the battle that no one saw a mule wagon halt on the road and a giant man step out. It wasn't until I realized that the shouting had stopped behind us and that the girls and boys beside me were falling back that I looked up. Mr. Morrison towered above us. He did not look at me or Christopher John or little man, although I knew he had seen us, but walked straight to the fighters and lifted a still swinging Stacy off of TJ. After a long, tense moment, he said to Stacy, "You and your sisters and your brothers get back in the wagon." We walked through the now silent crowd. Caleb and Dewberry Wallace standing on the front porch of the store with the Simses stared at Mr. Morrison as we passed, but Mr. Morrison looked through them, as if they were not there. Stacy sat in the front of the wagon with Mr. Morrison. The rest of us climbed in the back. "Now we gonna get it?" shuddered Christopher John. "I told y'all we should have gone on home." Before Mr. Morrison took the reins, he handed Stacy a handkerchief in which to wrap his bruised right hand, but he did not say a word, and it wasn't until we had passed the crossroads leading to Great Faith that the silence was broken. "Mr. Morrison, are you going to tell Mama?" Stacy asked huskily. Mr. Morrison was very quiet as Jack the mule clopped noisily along the dry road. "Seems I heard your Mama tell y'all not to go up to that Wallace store," he said at last. "Yes, sir," said Stacy, glancing nervously at Mr. Morrison, and then he blurted out, "But I had a good reason." "Ain't never no reason good enough to go disobey your Mama." The boys and I looked woefully at each other, and my bottom stung from the awful thought of Mama's leather strap against it. But Mr. Morrison," I cried anxiously, "TJ was hiding there 'cause he thought Stacy would never come down there to get him, but Stacy had to go down there 'cause TJ was cheating." "Hush, Cassie," Stacy ordered, turning sharply around. I faltered for only a moment before deciding that my bottom was more important than Stacy's code of honor. And Stacy had to take the blame for it, and Mama whipped him right in front of God and everybody. And once the truth had been disclosed, I waited with dry throat and nauseous stomach for Mr. Morrison to say something. And when he did, all of us strained tensely forward. "I ain't going to tell her," he said quietly. Christopher John sighed with relief. "Ain't going down there no more neither," he promised. Little man and I agreed. But Stacy stared long and hard at Mr. Morrison. "How come, Mr. Morrison?" he asked. "How come you ain't going to tell Mama?" Mr. Morrison slowed Jack as we turned into the road leading home. "'Cause I'm leaving it up to you to tell her." "What?" we exclaimed together. "Sometimes a person's got to fight," he said slowly. "But that store ain't the place to be doing it. And from what I hear, folks like them Wallaces got no respect at all for colored folks, and they just think it's funny when we fight each other. Your mama knowed them Wallaces ain't good folks. That's why she don't want y'all down there. Y'all owe it to her, y'all selves, to tell her. I'm gonna leave it up to y'all to decide." Stacy nodded thoughtfully and wound the handkerchief tighter around his wounded hand. His face was not scarred, so if he could just figure out a way to explain the bruises on his hand to Mama without lying, he was in the clear, for Mr. Morrison had not said that he had to tell her. But for some reason I could not understand, he said, "All right, Mr. Morrison, I'll tell her." "Boy, are you crazy?" I cried as Christopher John, little man, speedily came to the same conclusion. If he did not care about his own skin, he could at least consider ours. But he seemed not to hear us as his eyes met Mr. Morrison's, and the two of them smiled in subtle understanding, the distance between them fading. As we neared the house, Mr. Granger's Packard rolled from the dusty driveway. Mr. Morrison directed Jack to the side of the road until the big car had passed, and then swung the wagon back into the road center and up the drive. Big Ma was standing by the yard gate that led onto the drive, gazing across the road at the forest. "Big Ma, what was Mr. Granger doing here?" Stacy asked, jumping up from the wagon and going to her. Little man Christopher John and I hopped down and followed him. "Oh, nothing," Big Ma replied absently, her eyes still on the forest. "Just worrying me about this land again." "Oh," said Stacy, his tone indicating that he considered the visit of no importance. Mr. Granger had always wanted the land. He turned and went to help Mr. Morrison. Little man and Christopher John went with him, but I remained by the gate with Big Ma. "Big Ma," I said, "what Mr. Granger need more land for?" "Don't need it," Big Ma said flatly. "Got more land now and he know what to do with." "Or what he want ours for, then?" "Just like to have it, that's all." "Well, it seems to me he's just being greedy. You ain't going to sell it to him, are you?" Big Ma did not answer me. Instead, she pushed open the gate and walked down the drive and across the road into the forest. I ran after her. We walked in silence down the narrow cow path which wound through the old forest to the pond. As we neared the pond, the forest gaped open into a wide brown glade, man-made by the felling of many trees, some of them still on the ground. They had been cut during the summer after Mr. Anderson came from Strawberry with an offer to buy the trees. The offer was backed with a threat, and Big Ma was afraid. So Anderson's lumbermen came, chopping and sawing and destroying the fine old trees. Papa was away on the railroad then, but Mama sent Stacy for him. He returned and stopped the cutting, but not before many of the trees had already fallen. Big Ma surveyed the clearing without a word, then stepping aside around the rotten trees, she made her way to the pond and sat down on one of them. I sat close beside her and waited for her to speak. After a while, she shook her head and she said, "I'm sure glad your grandpa never had to see none of this." Sorry. He dearly loved these old trees. Him and me, we used to come down here early mornings or just before the sun was about to set and sit and talk. He used to call this place his thinking spot. He called that old pond there Caroline after me. She smiled vaguely but not at him. "You know, I wasn't hardly 18 when Paul Edward married me and brung me here. He was older than me by about 8 years, and he was smart. Oh, my Lord, that was one smart man. He had himself a mind like a steel trap. Anything he seen done, he could do it. He done learned carpentering back up there near Macon, Georgia, where he was born. Born into slavery, he was. 2 years 'fore freedom come. And him and his mama stayed on at that plantation after the fighting was finished. But then, when he got to be 14 and his mama died, he left that place and worked his way across here up to Vicksburg. That's where he met you, ain't it, Big Ma? I asked, already knowing the answer. Big Ma nodded, smiling. Sure was. He was carpentering up there, and my papa took me in with him to Vicksburg. We was tenant farming about 30 miles from there to see about getting a store-bought rocker for my mama. There was old Paul Edward working in that furniture shop just as big. He had himself a good job, but that old job wasn't what he wanted. He wanted himself some land. Kept on talking about land. And then this place come up for sale, and he bought himself 200 acres from that Yankee, didn't he? Big Ma chuckled. That man went right on over to see Mr. Hollenbeck, and he said, Mr. Hollenbeck, I understand you got land to sell, and I'd be interested in buying me about 200 acres if your price is right. Old Mr. Hollenbeck questioned him good about where he going to get the money to pay him, but Paul Edward just said, don't seem to me it's your worry about how I'm going to get the money just as long as you get paid your price. Didn't nothing scare that man. She beamed proudly, and Mr. Hollenbeck went on and let him have it. Of course, now he was just about as eager to sell the land as Paul Edward was to buy it. He'd been had it for going on now 20 years. Bought it during Reconstruction from the Grangers. 'Cause they didn't have no money to pay their taxes. Not only didn't have tax money, didn't have no money at all. That war left 'em plumb broke. That old Confederate money, it weren't worth nothing. And both Northern and Southern soldiers done ransacked their place. Them Grangers didn't have nothing but the land left, and they had to sell 2,000 acres of it to get more money to pay the taxes and rebuild the rest of it. And that Yankee bought the whole 2,000. And then he turned round and tried to sell it back to him, huh, Big Ma? Sure did. But not till 87, when your grandpa bought himself that 200 acres. As I hears it, that Yankee offered to sell 2,000 acres back to Holland Granger's daddy for less than the land was worth, but that old Fillmore Granger was just about as tight with a penny as anybody ever lived. He wouldn't buy it back. So Mr. Hollenbeck just let other folks know he was selling, and it didn't take long before he sold all of it, 'cause it was some mighty fine land. Besides your grandpa, a bunch of other small farmers bought up 800 acres, and Mr. Jameson bought the rest. But that wasn't our Mr. Jameson, I supplied knowingly. That was his daddy. Charles Jameson was his name, Big Ma said. Fine old gentleman, too. He was a good neighbor. He always treated us fair, just like his son. The Jamesons was what folks call Old South, from up in Vicksburg. And as I understands it, before the war, they had as much money as anybody. And even after the war, they managed better than some other folks, 'cause they had made themselves some northern money. Anyway, old Mr. Jameson got it into his mind that he wanted to farm, and moved his family down from Vicksburg into here. Mr. Wade Jameson was about 8 years old then. But he didn't like to farm, I said. Oh, he liked it all right. He just wasn't never much hand at it, though. And after he went up north to law school and all, he just felt he ought to practice his law. Is that how come he sold Grandpa them other 200 acres? Sure is. It was mighty good of him to do it, too. My Paul Edward been eyeing that 200 acres ever since 1910, when he paid off the bank for the first 200. But old Mr. Jameson didn't want to sell. About that same time, Holland Granger come head of the Granger plantation. You know, him and Wade Jameson about the same year as children. And he wanted to buy back every inch of land that used to belong to the Grangers. That man crazy about anything that was before that war. And he wanting his land to be every bit like it was then. Already had more than 4,000 acres, but he just itching to have back them other 2,000 his granddaddy sold. Got back 800 of them, too, from them other farmers that bought from Mr. Hollenbeck. But Grandpa and old Mr. Jameson wasn't interested in selling, period, was they, Big Ma? They didn't care how much money Mr. Granger offered them, I declared with an emphatic nod. Well, that's the truth of it, agreed Big Ma. But when Mr. Jameson died in 1918 and Wade come head of the family, he sold them 200 acres to Paul Edward and the rest of his land to Holland Granger, moved his family into Strawberry. He could have just as easily sold the full 1,000 acres to Granger and gotten more money, but he didn't. And till this day, Holland Granger still holds it against him, 'cause he didn't. Soft swish of fallen leaves made Big Ma look up from the pond and the trees again. Her lips curved into a tender smile. She looked around thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "I can still see my Paul Edwards' face the day Mr. Jameson sold him them 200 acres. He put his arms around me and looked out at his new piece of land, and then he said exactly the same thing he said when he grabbed himself them first 200 acres. He said, 'Pretty Caroline, how'd you like to work this fine piece of earth with me?' He sure did, same exact thing." She grew quiet then and rubbed the wrinkles down one hand as if to smooth them away. I gazed at the pond, glassy gray and calm, until she was ready to go on. I had learned that at times like these it was better to just sit and wait than to go on asking disrupting questions which might vex her. "It's so long ago now," she said eventually in a voice that was almost a whisper. "We worked real hard getting them crops sown and getting them reaped, and we had us a time. But there was good times too. We was young and strong when we started out like we liked to work. Neither one of us, I'm proud to say, never was lazy. We didn't raise us no lazy children neither. Had ourselves 6 fine babies. Lost to girls when they were babies, though. I suppose that's one of the reasons I love your sweet mama so much. But them boys grew strong, and all of them loved this place as much as Paul Edward and me. They go away, they always come back to it. Couldn't leave it." She shook her head and sighed. "Well, then Mitchell, he got killed in the war, and Kevin got drowned." Her voice faded completely, but when she spoke again it had hardened, and there was a determined glint in her eyes. "Now all the boys that got's my baby boys. Your papa, your Uncle Hammer, and this place as much as it is theirs as much as it is mine. Their blood's in this land, and hear that Holland Granger always talking about buying it. He pestered Paul Edward to death about buying it, now he's pestering me." She grumped angrily. "He don't know nothing about me or this land he think I'm going to sell." She became silent again. A cold wind rose biting through my jacket, and I shivered. Big Ma looked down at me for the first time. "Are you cold?" No, ma'am." I stuttered, not ready to leave the forest. "Don't you be lying to me, girl," she snapped, putting out her hand. "It's time we was going back to the house anyways. Your mom will be home soon." I took a hand, and we left the Caroline. All right, so you guys wanted extra literature yesterday, so I'm going to leave it up to Mrs. Kramer to decide. You can keep listening now, or you can listen at the end of the day, and it is completely Mrs. Kramer's decision. So if she pauses the video, that's fine, and it can start up again. So here we go. Despite our every effort to persuade Stacy otherwise, when Mama came home, he confessed that he had been fighting TJ at the Wallace store and that Mr. Morrison had stopped it. He stood awkwardly before her, disclosing only those things which he could honorably mention. He said nothing of TJ's cheating, or that Christopher John Little Man and I had been with him, and when Mama asked him a question he could not answer honestly, he simply looked at his feet and refused to speak. The rest of us sat fidgeting nervously throughout the interview, and Mama looked our way. We swiftly found somewhere else to rest our eyes. Finally, seeing that she had gotten all the information she was going to get from Stacy, Mama turned to us. "Now, I suppose you 3 went to that store too, huh?" But before any of us could speak and answer, she exclaimed, "That does it," and began to pace the floor, her arms folded across her face crossed. Although she scolded us severely, she did not whip us. We were sent to bed early, but we didn't consider that a punishment, and we doubted that Mama did either. How we had managed to escape a whipping we couldn't fathom until Saturday, when Mama woke us before dawn and piled us into the wagon. Taking us southward toward Smellens Creek, she said, "Where we're going, the man is very sick, and he doesn't look like other people. But I don't want you to be afraid or uncomfortable when you see him. You just be yourselves." We rode for almost 2 hours before turning onto a backwoods trail. We were jarred and bounced all over the rough road until we entered a clearing where a small weather-grayed house stood, and fields stretched barren beyond it. As Mama pulled up on the raids and ordered us down, the front door cracked warily open, but no one appeared, and then Mama said, "Good morning, Mrs. Barry. It's Mary Logan, David's wife." The door swung wide then, and an elderly woman, frail and toothless, stepped out. Her left arm hung crazily at her side as if it had been broken long ago but had not mended properly, and she walked with a limp. Yet she smiled widely, throwing her good arm around Mama and hugging her. "Oh, land sakes, child, ain't you something?" she exclaimed. "Come to see about these old bones. I just says to Sam, I says, now who you reckon come to see old folks like us? These your babies, ain't they? Oh, Lord Almighty, ain't they fine? It sure is." She hugged each of us and ushered us into the house. The interior was dark, lit only by the narrow slat of gray daylight allowed in by the open door. Stacy and I carried cans of milk and butter, and Christopher John and the little man each had a jar of beef and a jar of Crowder peas which Mama and Big Ma had canned. Mrs. Barry took the food, her thanks intermingled with questions about Big Ma, Papa, and the others. And when she had put the food away, she pulled stools from the darkness and motioned us to sit down, and then she went to the blackest corner and said, "Daddy, who you s'pose come to see us?" And there was no recognizable answer, only an inhuman guttural wheezing. But Mrs. Barry seemed to accept it and went on, "Miss Logan and her babies, ain't that something?" She took a sheet from a nearby table. "I gots to cover him," she exclaimed. "He can't hardly stand to have nothing touch him." When she was visible again, she picked up a candle stump and felt around the table for matches. "He can't speak no more. The fire burned him too bad, but he understands all right." Finding the matches, she lit the candle and turned once more to the corner. A still form lay there staring at us with glittering eyes. The face had no nose, and the head no hair. The skin was scarred, burned, and the lips were weazened black like charcoal. As the wheezing sound echoed from the opening that was a mouth, Mama said, "Say good morning to Mrs. Barry's husband."